Chapter 1: The Sour Ground. The air over Black Matheson's bog was thin and sharp. It carried the scent of wet peat, cold stone, and something else, a clean, sterile emptiness. Dougal MacLeod, whose family had raised sheep on the surrounding hills for 200 years, called it the sour ground. Nothing grew well in the bog's heart. The heather was stunted, the grasses were sparse and pale, and the water that pooled in its dark hollows was the color of flat black tea. Birds seemed to arc their flight paths around its perimeter. Even the ever-present Scottish midges were less bothersome here. Hamish Baird stood on a temporary timber platform, his boots planted wide. He surveyed the operation with a practiced, impassive gaze. Generators hummed a dissonant chord against the profound quiet. A small city of canvas tents and portable cabins had been erected on the firmest patch of land at the bog's edge. His job was logistics and security, which meant he was responsible for preventing a half-dozen academics from sinking their Land Rover, and themselves, into 1,000 years of accumulated sphagnum. "Anything, Maeve," Fintan Cormac's voice cut through the stillness. He stood beside a humming console, his posture taut with a proprietary excitement. His face, usually set in a default of academic weariness, was animated. Maeve Connolly leaned closer to the screen of the ground-penetrating radar. Her expression was a mixture of concentration and awe. "The readings are strange, Professor. The density is all wrong for peat or bedrock. And the shape," she traced a finger over the screen, following a long, elegant curve rendered in false color green and orange. "It's too perfect." Fintan moved to her side, his tweed jacket doing little to ward off the damp chill. He stared at the image, his breath misting. For years, his theories on pre-Norse settlements in the Scottish Highlands had been dismissed, relegated to footnotes in more conservative papers. He saw more than an anomaly on a screen, he saw vindication. "It's a structure," he said, his voice low. "Symmetrical, man-made." Hamish grunted from his perch on the platform. "Could be a collapsed sheepfold, a stone wall. This land's got history." "Not at this depth, Hamish," Fintan countered without turning. "And not with this profile. This is boat-shaped, long and narrow." "A boat in a bog miles from the sea." Hamish shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. "Ambitious sailor." Maeve ignored him, her focus absolute. "The length, it's over 70 feet. Professor, if this is a vessel, it's a significant one." Fintan's mind raced. He imagined a Viking longship, a chieftain's burial, a forgotten piece of history preserved in the anaerobic gloom. This was it, the find that would force them to listen, the discovery that would carve his name into the annals. The sour ground, he thought, was about to become sacred. "We're shifting focus," Fintan announced, his voice ringing with newfound authority. He pointed to the area Maeve had indicated on her screen, a section of the bog that looked no different from any other. "We open a trench here. I want 5 meters by 20. Shore it up properly, Hamish. I don't want this place collapsing on our heads before we see what's inside." Hamish gave a curt nod. "Aye, Professor, your hole in the ground." He turned to organize the local diggers, men hired for their strong backs and experience with the treacherous terrain. Fintan placed a hand on Maeve's shoulder, his eyes fixed on the blank expanse of peat. Get your cameras ready, Maeve. We're about to make history. She looked up at him, her youthful enthusiasm a bright counterpoint to the desolate landscape. A gust of wind swept across the bog, carrying a scent that momentarily overpowered the peat. It was a dry, dusty aroma like spices in a long-sealed jar. Maeve shivered, pulling her coat tighter. The sun was weak, a pale disk in a sky the color of slate, and it offered no warmth at all. Chapter 2: The Sorrow Worm. The work was brutal. Each spadeful of peat was a dense, wet weight that fought to be lifted. The diggers, local men with faces weathered like the surrounding tors, worked in a steady rhythm, their breathing ragged in the cold air. Water, black and oily, seeped constantly from the trench walls, defeated by the noisy chug of a petrol-powered pump. Hamish oversaw the shoring, his commands sharp and precise as he directed the placement of heavy timbers and corrugated steel sheets. The bog did not want to yield its secrets. Finton was a constant presence at the edge of the trench, a hawk watching his prey. He drank endless cups of tea from a thermos, the steam mingling with his condensing breath. Every few hours, Maeve would descend into the pit with her instruments, her readings growing more defined, more exciting. The anomaly was there. It was solid. On the third day, a spade struck something with a dull thud that was not the squelch of peat or the grate of stone. The lead digger stopped, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a muddy glove. "Got something, Professor. Feels like wood." Finton was down the ladder in a moment, his academic decorum forgotten. He knelt in the mud, scrabbling at the dark soil with his bare hands. He unearthed a section of a plank, black as jet, its surface unnaturally smooth and hard. It was not rotten. It was petrified, preserved as if it were iron. "Gently," he whispered, more to himself than to the workers. "Brush it down, gently." Over the next few hours, they uncovered more. A curved section of a hull emerged from the peat like the spine of a leviathan. It was clinker-built, the overlapping planks held together with large, dark rivets. Finton ran his hand across the surface, his expression one of rapturous disbelief. That evening he made the call. "Owen, it's Finton Cormac. You are not going to believe what we've found." Professor Owen Price arrived 2 days later, a small, bird-like man bundled in a thick coat, his eyes bright with intellectual fire. He was the foremost expert on Old Norse and runic inscriptions, coaxed from a comfortable semi-retirement in Cardiff by Finton's breathless descriptions. He stood at the edge of the growing excavation, staring down at the exposed flank of the vessel. "Oh my," was all he said for a full minute. He descended the ladder with a slow, careful gait, his gaze locked on the emergent structure. "It's a burial, Owen, it must be," Finton said, joining him. "The preservation is perfect." "Perfect is not the word, Finton," Owen murmured, his gloved fingers tracing a faint groove in one of the upper strakes. "This wood feels wrong. It's too dense, too cold." He followed the line of the hull toward the partially exposed stem post. There, almost invisible against the black wood, were carvings. Maeve set up a portable light, its stark beam cutting through the gloom of the trench. The carvings were runes. They were sharp, angular, and deeply cut. Owen knelt, pulling a pair of spectacles from his pocket. He cleaned the mud from the symbols with a soft brush, his movements delicate and reverent. "Can you read it?" Maeve asked, her voice hushed. Owen was silent for a long time, his breath plumed. "Part of it, it's a name, the ship's name." He looked up, his eyes meeting Finton's over the top of his spectacles. The usual academic excitement was absent from his face. He seemed troubled. "Well," Finton pressed, his patience fraying. "The first part is weathered away," Owen said slowly, articulating each word with care. "But the second part, it's clear, Ormer, the serpent, the worm." He paused, brushing away more grime. "And the word before it, sorg, grief, sorrow." He stood up, dusting the mud from his knees. "They called her Sorgormer, the sorrow worm." The name hung in the damp air. The pump sputtered and died, plunging the trench into a sudden, profound silence. For the first time, the vessel before them ceased to be an archaeological treasure. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, the exposed hull, with its overlapping planks like giant scales, looked exactly like the skeletal remains of a great serpent, coiled in its ageless grief. A low vibration started to thrum through the soles of their boots, a hum so deep it was almost felt rather than heard. It seemed to come from the ship itself, a sleeping thing stirring in its grave. Chapter 3: The Amber and the Ash. The hum was a source of constant debate for the first 24 hours. Hamish blamed the main generator's overloaded circuits. Maeve theorized it was a low-frequency resonance from water moving through a hidden cavity in the bedrock. Finton, consumed by the discovery, barely noticed it. Only Owen seemed disturbed, frequently pressing his palm against the ship's hull as if taking its pulse. Getting inside the ship was a new challenge. The deck planks, like the hull, were supernaturally resilient. They resisted modern saws, the blades screaming and sparking against the black wood. Finally, Hamish, with a grim set to his jaw, used a heavy-duty angle grinder, filling the air with a sharp, resinous stench and a shower of orange sparks. When they finally pried a section of the deck open, the air that escaped from within was not the expected smell of rot and decay. It was dry, spicy, and ancient. Finton was the first to peer inside, his headlamp cutting a bright slash through the absolute darkness. "My God," he breathed. The interior was not filled with mud or water. It was an open space, a dark cavern coated in a fine gray dust, and it was occupied. Figures were seated on benches along the hull. They were not skeletons. They were desiccated husks, humanoid shapes of taut, leathery skin stretched over bone, their forms perfectly preserved. There were more than 20 of them, clad in the remnants of wool and leather. One by one, the team descended into the hold. The dust, disturbed by their movement, swirled in their torch beams. It was fine as ash. "They look like they're cowering," Maeve whispered, aiming her light at a figure slumped against the mast, its hands covering its face. "They're not warriors," Owen added, his voice trembling slightly. "Look at them. There are women, a child." He pointed to a small form curled up beside one of the female figures. The sight was deeply unsettling. These were not chieftains laid to rest with their swords. They were refugees. Then Maeve's light caught something that wasn't gray dust or black wood. "Professor, over here." On the central figure, a large man seated on a raised platform that might have been a chieftain's chair, was a strange coating. A thick, lumpy substance the color of dark honey and cloudy amber covered his entire torso and lap. It gleamed softly in their lights, its surface smooth and organic. Smaller pieces, like uncut jewels, were scattered around the deck and clutched in the hands of some of the other bodies. Fenton approached the central figure, his scientific curiosity overriding his unease. He reached out and touched the strange substance. "It's warm," he said, surprised. It was true. A faint biological heat emanated from the amber-like material. "It must be a form of resin, a local variety. It's what preserved them. This is incredible, a new form of mummification." Just as he spoke, Dr. Lena Jensen appeared at the opening above, her climbing gear contrasting with her neat, practical lab coat. Fenton had called her from the University of Copenhagen's geochemistry department the moment they saw the carvings. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "The flight was delayed. What have you got for me, Fenton?" Her professional demeanor evaporated as she took in the scene. She descended quickly, her eyes wide. "Remarkable." She wasted no time pulling a sample kit from her pack. She approached the central figure, her gaze clinical. "You say this is resin." "What else could it be?" Fenton asked. Lena scraped a small fragment from the edge of the large mass. It came away with a soft, pliable texture. She examined it in her palm. "It's not hard enough, and this warmth. Resin doesn't generate its own heat." She spotted a loose, fist-sized nodule of the stuff near one of the benches. "I'll take this one for a preliminary analysis. I need a controlled environment, heat, light." Fenton nodded eagerly. "The main research tent is at your disposal." As Lena prepared to ascend with her sample, Owen Price, who had been studying the interior walls of the hold, called out. His voice was strained. "Fenton, there are more runes here, carved into the keel." Fenton was torn, but the promise of translation was too great. "Go ahead, Owen. Tell us what they say." Lena climbed out, carrying the amber-like nodule carefully in her gloved hands. Back in the research tent, she placed the strange object on a stainless steel tray beneath the bright, hot glare of an examination lamp. She turned her back to it for a moment to power on her portable spectrometer. The hum from the ship outside seemed to find an echo in the tent, a vibration that made the instruments on her table tremble. Under the direct heat of the lamp, a hairline fracture, almost too fine to see, spiderwebbed across the surface of the amber nodule. Chapter 4: The Whispering Runes. Owen Price worked in his personal tent, a small canvas island of scholarly clutter amidst the larger camp. The hum was a persistent pressure against his eardrums, making concentration difficult. He transcribed the runes from the ship's hold onto a notepad, his pen scratching frantically. The grammar was all wrong. The syntax was inverted, the word order chaotic. It wasn't the proud prose of a saga, it was the disjointed, panicked scrawl of a dying hand. Fragments emerged, disconnected and terrifying. "A hive wakes. A song is the seed. Is silence the amber heart?" He rubbed his temples, a splitting headache blooming behind his eyes. These were not the writings of Vikings he understood. This was a different dialect, one laced with an unfamiliar terror. He found another recurring phrase carved deeper than the others, almost gouged into the wood. "Do not warm the jewel." A cold dread, stark and unwelcome, settled upon him. He thought of Lena Jensen marching off to the research tent with her amber nodule, toward the warmth and light of her equipment. In that very tent, Lena squinted at the readings on her spectrometer. They made no sense. The substance was organic, composed of complex proteins and chitinous compounds she had never encountered. It was a biological secretion, not a geological formation. She heard a faint crackle like ice shifting in a glass. She turned. The fracture on the nodule had widened, and a thin, oily vapor, almost invisible, curled from it. The overhead lights flickered violently. "Generator on the fritz," she muttered, making a note on her clipboard. A prickling sensation started on the back of her neck, 1,000 tiny needles. She dismissed it as a draft. Outside, Hamish made his final perimeter check before turning in. The camp was quiet, save for the generator's drone and the ceaseless hum from the bog. He found a dead crow on the path near the main tent. He nudged it with his boot. The bird was stiff, its body oddly rigid. Both its eyes were gone, leaving empty, dark sockets. He frowned. A fox would have taken the whole bird. He kicked it into the heather and moved on. Finton and Maeve were in the site office, a portable cabin filled with maps and finds trays. Finton was euphoric, outlining the structure of the paper that would redefine his career. A previously unknown Norse sect, driven from their homeland, seeking refuge and carrying with them a unique embalming agent. "It doesn't feel like embalming, Professor," Maeve said quietly, looking out the window toward the dark shape of the ship. "It feels like a tomb." The hum seemed louder now, a physical presence in the night. It made her teeth ache. Owen stumbled from his tent, his face ashen in the stark light of the camp's floodlights. He held a sheet of paper clutched in his hand, his knuckles white. He saw Finton through the cabin window and started toward him, his steps unsteady. "The warmth, Finton, the warmth hatches it," he croaked, his voice raw. "The runes, they are a quarantine, a warning, we have to stop." His words were cut short. From the main research tent came a sound that sliced through the night. It was not a hum or a drone. It was a high-frequency chitter, a crystalline, scraping noise that grated on the nerves. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny things, all waking at once. And then Lena screamed. It was a single, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated terror that was abruptly cut off. Chapter 5: The First Hatching. Hamish was the first to move. He broke into a sprint, his heavy boots pounding the damp earth. Finton, his face a mask of confusion, was a few steps behind him. They reached the research tent's zipped entrance. "Lena," Finton shouted, fumbling with the zipper. It was stuck. "Something's blocking it." "Stand aside," Hamish ordered. He didn't wait for an answer. He drew a heavy utility knife from his belt and slashed a long, vertical gash in the canvas wall. He shouldered his way through the opening. The scene inside was chaos. Papers and delicate instruments were strewn across the floor. A table was overturned. The bright examination lamp had been knocked askew, its beam now pointing at the tent ceiling. In the center of the floor, Lena Jensen lay convulsing, her limbs jerking spastically. The small amber nodule on the steel tray was shattered, nothing more than a pile of gleaming shards. Crawling over Lena, over the floor, over the equipment, was a tide of small, beetle-like insects. Each was the size of a thumbnail, with a hard, polished carapace the color of dark honey. They moved with terrifying speed, and their legs made the incessant, high-pitched chittering sound that filled the air. As Hamish and Finton stared in frozen horror, the swarm turned its collective attention on them. The chittering intensified as they surged forward. Hamish reacted on pure instinct. He grabbed the red fire extinguisher from its bracket by the door, pulled the pin, and aimed the nozzle at the advancing tide. A thick cloud of white CO2 blasted into the tent, rolling over the insects. The chittering sound abated as dozens of the creatures were flash-frozen, their legs ceasing their frantic motion. The rest of the swarm retreated, scurrying into the dark corners of the tent and under the overturned furniture. Finton rushed to Lena's side. Her convulsions were subsiding, replaced by a deep tremor. Her eyes were wide open but saw nothing. Maeve, who had followed them, stood in the slash Hamish had cut, her hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes huge with shock. Finton saw it then. Clinging to the back of Lena's neck just below the hairline was a different creature. It was larger, nearly the length of his finger, with a slender, wasp-like body and translucent wings that trembled. A wicked-looking ovipositor, hard and sharp as an amber needle, was buried deep in Lena's flesh. Before Finton could even process what he was seeing, Hamish knelt, his face a grim stone mask. He brought his gloved fist down on the creature with brutal efficiency. There was a wet crunch. The thing's body ruptured, oozing a thick, viscous fluid that smelled sickly sweet. Where the creature's stinger had been embedded in Lena's skin, the flesh was red and hideously inflamed. And beneath the surface, something pulsed with a soft, internal light. Owen Price appeared behind Maeve, his face pale and slick with sweat. He held up his notes, his finger shaking as he pointed first at the pulsing wound on Lena's neck, then toward the dark, silent ship in the bog. "The jewel, warmed by the light. It hatches," he stammered, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening finality. "It does not kill, it plants the seed. The song is the call to wake the hive." Finton looked from Lena's vacant eyes to the horrified face of the old professor. He finally understood. This was no great discovery. This was an ancient plague, a biological weapon a desperate crew had tried to bury forever. They were not archaeologists. They were grave robbers, and they had just kicked open the door to a 1,000-year-old prison. As if in answer, the low hum from the ship outside changed. The frequency shifted, rising in pitch until it was an audible, resonant note. It was no longer a vibration. It was a command. And from the black, gaping maw of the Sorgormer's hold, a new sound arose. A vast, echoing wave of chittering, 1,000 times louder than the noise in the tent, answered the call. The main brood was awake, and it was hungry. Chapter 6: The Quarantine. The resonant hum from the ship became a physical force. It vibrated through the ground, rattled the equipment in the tents, and set every nerve on edge. The answering chitter from the Sorgormer was a sound of pure, skittering hunger, a million tiny legs scrabbling over ancient wood, preparing to emerge. "Back to the office," Hamish roared, his voice cutting through the rising panic. He grabbed the still trembling Lena, hoisting her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. Her limbs were limp, her head lolling with an unnatural slackness. Maeve Fenton, move. Fenton was frozen, his mind a vortex of denial and scholarly analysis. This was impossible. It defied every known biological and historical principle. He was an archaeologist, not a character in some Gothic tale. "Professor!" Maeve screamed, grabbing his arm and pulling him. The urgency in her voice finally broke his trance. He stumbled after her, his gaze locked on the pulsating, faintly glowing wound on Lena's neck as Hamish carried her away. The light was spreading, a sickening, subterranean luminescence just beneath the skin. Owen was already hobbling toward the portable cabin, his face a deathly white. "Barricade the door," he gasped as they tumbled inside. "They will follow the host." Hamish laid Lena on the long map table, shoving aside charts and finds trays. He slammed the cabin door shut and jammed a heavy chair under the handle. "That won't hold them," he stated flatly. He scanned the small office, his eyes cataloging every potential weakness. The single window, the thin walls. Outside, the air filled with the rustle of a million wings. It wasn't the sound of flight, but of a crawling tide emerging from the earth. The chittering grew louder, a wave of noise that seemed to come from every direction at once. "The runes," Owen panted, collapsing into a chair. He spread his notes on the floor. "The crew, they didn't fight them. They couldn't. They sealed themselves in. They chose to be buried with the matron." "Matron?" Fenton asked, his voice shaking. "The Queen, the Amber Heart," Owen explained, his finger tracing a complex symbol. "The large body in the ship covered in that resin, it's not a king. It's the Hive Mother. She is the source. The others, they are just her children, her workers." Maeve crept to the window, peering through a small gap in the blinds. Her breath hitched. The floodlights of the camp illuminated a nightmare. A glistening, moving carpet of the small, beetle-like insects, the drudges, as Owen's runes had named them, was pouring out of the ship. They flowed over the timber walkways and across the peat, a single, undulating entity. They weren't swarming randomly. They were moving with purpose, heading directly for their cabin. "They're coming," she whispered. On the table, Lena began to moan. It was a low, guttural sound, inhuman. The glowing area on her neck had expanded, a soft, honey-colored light now illuminating the side of her face. Her skin was becoming translucent, revealing a faint, web-like pattern of fibers beneath. "What is happening to her?" Fenton choked out. "The seed grows," Owen murmured, not looking up from his notes. "It remakes the flesh. It turns the host into a nursery." Hamish moved to the window, his expression grim. "They aren't trying to get in. They're surrounding us." He was right. The swarm wasn't battering the door or scratching at the walls. It was forming a wide, silent perimeter around the cabin, a living fence of chittering bodies. Then a new sound began. A rhythmic scraping noise against the side of the cabin. It was slow, deliberate. Maeve risked another look. A different creature was out there. It was larger, spider-like, with long, spindly legs and a swollen, amber-hued abdomen. It was one of the amber weavers, and it was methodically secreting a thick, fibrous resin onto the cabin wall, the same substance that had encased the bodies on the ship. It was not trying to break in. It was sealing them inside. My God, Fenton breathed, the horrifying realization dawning on him. It's not a prison, it's a cocoon. Lena screamed again, but this time her voice was different. It was higher, thinner, and harmonized with the incessant chittering from outside. The glow in her neck pulsed brightly, a sickening beacon in the dim cabin. The song from the ship, the matron's call, had found its first new voice. Chapter 7: The Song of the Seed. The scraping continued for hours. It was a maddening, deliberate sound, the sonic equivalent of being buried alive. One amber weaver was joined by another, then a third. They worked tirelessly, their movements synchronized, spinning a thick, semi-translucent wall of resin over the cabin's window and door. The light from the camp's floodlights, already weak, was reduced to a diffuse, sickly yellow glow filtering through the hardening amber. Inside the cabin, the air grew thick and warm. The only light came from a single battery-powered lantern and the horrifying, pulsing luminescence emanating from Lena. The glow had spread across her shoulders and down her arm, the network of fibrous tendrils beneath her skin now clearly visible. She was quiet, her breathing shallow, but her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling. A tear tracked a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She was conscious. She was aware. "We have to get her out of here," Fenton insisted, his voice cracking. "There has to be a way to reverse this." "Reverse what?" Hamish retorted, his pragmatism a cold splash of water. "Look at her, Professor. There's no hospital for this. There's no cure. She's a contamination." The coldness in his words shocked Fenton. "She is our colleague." "She is a host for that thing," Hamish shot back, gesturing at the pulsing light. "And right now, she's a beacon leading every one of those creatures right to our door." Owen Price looked up from his notes, his face etched with exhaustion. "He is right, Fenton. The runes speak of it. The cantor. The one who sings the song of the seed. Once the transformation begins, the host becomes an extension of the matron's will. They amplify her call." As if on cue, Lena's jaw went slack. A low, vibrating hum emerged from her throat, a perfect, resonant echo of the sound coming from the ship. It was a deeply unnatural sound for a human to make. The chittering outside the cabin immediately intensified, a frenzied response to her call. Maeve backed away from the table, her hands pressed to her ears. "Make her stop," she pleaded. "Please make it stop." There was nothing they could do. They were trapped in a box, being sealed into a tomb with a woman who was slowly turning into a monster's mouthpiece. Fenton watched, helpless, as the woman he respected, the brilliant scientist, was erased piece by piece. Her humanity was being hollowed out, replaced by this parasitic choir. Hamish began methodically checking his gear. A multi-tool, a length of rope, a signal flare. His face was set, his mind already working past the horror and onto the problem of survival. "The floor," he said, his voice low. "These cabins are on steel stilts. The floor is just insulated plywood. We might be able to cut through it." It was a sliver of hope. Fenton seized it. A way out. "A way down," Hamish corrected. "Into the mud, under the swarm." He looked at Lena and his expression hardened. "But we can't take her with us. She's the reason they're here. We move her, they follow." The terrible, unspoken choice hung in the air. To escape, they had to leave Lena behind. They had to abandon her to the things that were consuming her, to the amber weavers waiting to entomb her completely. It was an act of profound cruelty, a betrayal that felt as monstrous as the creatures outside. "No," Fenton said, his voice firm. "We don't leave our people behind." "She's not our people anymore, Professor," Hamish said, his voice devoid of malice, a simple statement of fact. "She belongs to the hive." Lena's humming stopped. Her head turned slowly, her neck moving with a stiff, ratcheting motion. Her eyes, now glowing with a faint amber light of their own, fixed on Hamish. A flicker of something ancient and intelligent passed across her face, an expression that was not her own. Then she smiled. It was a wide, predatory smile, and it did not belong on her face. Chapter 8: The Cold Escape. The smile broke them. It was the final, horrifying proof that the Lena they knew was gone, subsumed by the hive's consciousness. Fenton stared, his resolve crumbling into dust. That wasn't a human expression. It was a look of cold, alien amusement. Hamish didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heaviest tool he could find, a geological hammer with a pointed steel pick. "Price, get your notes. Maeve, the emergency kit. We go through the floor. Now." He strode to the corner of the cabin farthest from the door and brought the hammer down with a powerful, desperate swing. The plywood splintered with a loud crack. He struck it again and again, his grunts of exertion punctuated by the steady, unearthly hum from Lena on the table. She watched him, her head cocked, the predatory smile still fixed on her face. The hole grew with each impact. Soon it was wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Below was nothing but darkness and the smell of wet earth. "I'll go first," Hamish said. He tied one end of his rope to the leg of a heavy steel desk. "Lower yourselves down. Don't make a sound. Go for the service trench under the generator. It's the only cover between here and the Land Rover. Move." Owen, frail but determined, went first. He gripped the rope, his knuckles white, and disappeared into the darkness. Fenton could hear his soft landing in the mud below. "Maeve, you're next," Hamish commanded. Maeve looked from the hole in the floor to Lena on the table. Lena's humming had started again, louder this time. The glowing tendrils under her skin pulsed in time with the sound. "I can't," she whispered. "We can't just leave her." "We can and we will," Hamish said, his voice low and urgent. "This is survival, nothing more." He took her arm, his grip firm but not unkind. "Go." Fenton felt a profound sense of shame. He was the leader of this expedition. These people were his responsibility. He had brought them here to this god-forsaken bog, chasing his own vanity. And now he was abandoning one of them to an unimaginable fate. He met Lena's glowing eyes one last time. The intelligence was there, watching him, judging him. Sore Gormer, he thought, the sorrow worm. The grief wasn't the ship's. It was for what it carried inside. Maeve squeezed through the hole and slid down the rope. Fenton followed without another word, the shame a cold, heavy stone in his gut. The moment his feet hit the squelching mud beneath the cabin, the stench of the bog was overwhelming. He looked up. Through the hole, he could see the underside of the map table where Lena lay. The honey-colored light from her body illuminated the bottom of the cabin, a terrible, false dawn. Hamish was the last. He dropped the hammer, took one last look around the cabin that was fast becoming a tomb, and lowered himself down. He landed silently beside Finton. They were in a crawl space, the air thick with the smell of peat and generator fumes. Above them, Lena's song continued, a siren call to the swarm. Peering through the gap between the cabin floor and the ground, they could see them. Thousands of the drudges, their amber carapaces gleaming, formed a living wall around the cabin. They were utterly focused on the structure above, mesmerized by the host inside. Hamish pointed. A shallow ditch, dug for electrical conduits, ran from near their position toward the large, boxy shape of the main generator. It offered minimal cover, but it was their only chance. "Stay low, stay quiet," he breathed, "and whatever you do, don't look back." They began to crawl, their hands and knees sinking into the cold, damp mud. The hum from the hive seemed to vibrate in their very bones. Every squelch of mud, every rasp of breath sounded like a thunderclap. Finton kept his eyes fixed on Hamish's boots in front of him. He did not look back. He did not want to see the amber weavers completing their work. He did not want to see the light from the cabin wink out as the final layer of resin sealed Lena inside her coffin forever. The cold of the mud seeped into him, but it could not touch the deeper, more profound cold of his own failure. Chapter 9: A Vessel of Flesh. The crawl through the mud was an eternity of strained muscles and raw nerves. The chittering of the swarm was a constant, unnerving presence to their left, a sea of chitinous bodies waiting for a single mistake. They reached the generator, its loud, rhythmic chugging a welcome blanket of noise that covered their ragged breathing. From there, it was a 50-yard dash across open, boggy ground to the Land Rover. "Ready," Hamish whispered, crouching behind the generator. He pulled the signal flare from his pocket. "When I fire this, the noise and light should distract them. It won't be for long. Run. Don't stop for anything." He didn't wait for a reply. He aimed the flare pistol high over the ship, away from their escape route, and pulled the trigger. A brilliant red star shot into the night sky, exploding with a loud bang. It cast the entire bog in a hellish, crimson light. The swarm reacted instantly. The chittering rose to a panicked crescendo. The perimeter around the cabin broke as thousands of the drudges scurried toward the new stimulus, a river of confusion. "Go," Hamish yelled. They ran. Finton's lungs burned. His legs, unused to such exertion, felt like lead. Owen, surprisingly spry, kept pace, fueled by pure adrenaline. Maeve was a blur of motion ahead of them. The ground tried to suck the boots from their feet with every step. They reached the Land Rover, piling in as Hamish fumbled with the keys, his hands slick with mud. The engine turned over with a reassuring roar. He slammed the vehicle into gear, and the tires spun, struggling for purchase before finding solid ground. The rover lurched forward, away from the camp, away from the ship, away from the screaming red light of the flare. In the rearview mirror, Finton saw the swarm regrouping with terrifying speed, the distraction already fading. He also saw a new light. The portable cabin they had escaped from was now glowing, not just from the interior, but the entire structure. The resin shell spun by the weavers was a perfect conduit for the light emanating from Lena's transformed body. The whole cabin had become a colossal, pulsating amber lantern, a beacon of the hive's victory. They drove in silence for miles, the only sound the rattling of the chassis on the rough track. No one knew what to say. They had survived, but they had left a part of themselves back in that bog. It was Maeve who finally broke the silence. What was she? What was Lena becoming? Owen Price, huddled in the back seat, looked down at his notes, which he had shielded with his own body during the escape. The runes called the first host the resin cantor, he said, his voice heavy. Cantor means singer. Lena was the amplifier, but the cantor is only the first stage, a vessel. A vessel for what? Fenton asked, dreading the answer. For the next stage of the hive, Owen replied. He turned a page, his finger tracing a particularly vicious-looking rune. The runes speak of a new body for the matron. When a host is strong enough, the matron transfers. She leaves the old shell behind and inhabits the new flesh. The cantor becomes a walking queen, a new matron, free to travel and establish another nest. The implication was horrifying. They hadn't just left Lena to die. They had left her to become the new heart of the plague, a mobile, thinking, human-shaped monster with the intelligence of an ancient hive mind. Hamish swore under his breath, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We need to call someone, the police, the army. And tell them what? Fenton countered, the bitter reality of their situation crashing down on him. An ancient insect plague has been unleashed by an archaeology team in a bog. They'll lock us up for psychiatric evaluation. They won't believe us until it's too late. He's right, Owen said wearily. This is a secret that has been kept for 1,000 years. The world is not prepared for it. As they rounded a bend, the headlights swept across something in the road. Hamish slammed on the brakes, the rover skidding to a halt. It was a sheep, one of Dougal MacLeod's flock. It stood perfectly still, its head low. As they watched, its woolly side began to pulse with a faint, familiar, honey-colored light. It lifted its head, and from its throat came not a bleat but a low, vibrating hum. The infection was already spreading. The song of the seed was being carried by the local fauna. The bog was no longer the only quarantine zone. The entire valley was at risk. Chapter 10: The Shepherd's Warning. They couldn't go forward. The road ahead could be littered with more infected animals. Hamish reversed the Land Rover slowly, his eyes scanning the dark hills around them. We can't go back to the village. If the flock is compromised, the infection could already be there. Dougal MacLeod's farm, Fenton said suddenly. It's isolated up on the ridge. Away from the main flock's grazing pasture, he might be safe. He also told us to leave the bog alone, Maeve added quietly. He won't be happy to see us. He won't be happy when a swarm of ancient insects eats his sheep either, Hamish countered grimly. He knows this land. He might know something that can help. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. Hamish navigated the rover up a steep, barely there track that led toward the dark silhouette of a farmhouse on the hillside. The cottage was a small, solid stone building, its windows dark save for one, which showed the flickering, warm light of a fire. They parked a short distance away and approached on foot. The air here felt cleaner, colder. The oppressive hum from the bog was gone, replaced by the sound of the wind whistling around the stone walls. Hamish knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. After a long moment, a bolt scraped back and the door opened a crack. Dougal MacLeod stood there, a formidable figure in the shadows. He held a heavy-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles pointed squarely at Hamish's chest. His eyes, narrowed and sharp, took in the four of them, mud-stained, terrified, and clearly having fled something awful. "I told you lot to leave it be," Dougal said, his voice a low rumble. "Told you the ground was sour." "Mr. MacLeod," Finton began, stepping forward with his hands raised. "Please, something has happened, something terrible. We need your help." Dougal's eyes lingered on Finton, then moved to Owen's clutched notes, and finally to Maeve's pale, frightened face. He seemed to make a decision. He lowered the shotgun, though he did not set it aside. "In, all of you, now." He led them into a large, low-beamed kitchen. A peat fire burned in a massive stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. The room smelled of wood smoke, old wool, and sheepdogs. Two border collies rose from a rug by the fire, growling low in their throats. "Be quiet, lads," Dougal commanded, and the dogs fell silent, though their eyes never left the newcomers. He listened, his craggy face impassive, as Finton recounted the night's events. He didn't interrupt. He just stared into the fire, his jaw working silently. When Finton finished describing the glowing sheep on the road, Dougal finally spoke. "The honeyed plague," he said, the words sounding like a half-forgotten story. Owen looked up sharply. "What did you say?" "It's an old tale. My grandfather told it to me when I was a boy," Dougal explained, his gaze distant. "A story to keep children away from the sour ground. He said a ship of sea devils came here long ago. They brought a curse with them, a plague that didn't rot you but filled you with amber and stole your soul, turning you into a walking beehive for the devil's own insects." The folklore was so chillingly accurate that a fresh wave of fear washed over the room. This wasn't just a buried secret. It was a scar on the land, a memory that had festered into local legend. "He said the old lairds built watchtowers on the hills," Dougal continued, gesturing toward the window, "and that the cure was not in healing but in fire. They burned everything the plague touched. The land, the animals, the people. They burned it all to keep the sickness from spreading beyond this valley." He stood and walked to a heavy wooden chest in the corner of the room. He lifted the lid. Inside was not a collection of farming tools. It was an arsenal, ancient-looking rifles, boxes of ammunition, and several large metal canisters with nozzles attached. "What is that?" Hamish asked, nodding at a canister. "My granddad was a clever man," Dougal said, lifting one of the canisters. It was a vintage flamethrower, military surplus from a long-forgotten war. "He said you can't drown the devil's bees and you can't crush them all, but they burn. They burn real good." He looked at the four of them, his eyes hard and clear. "You dug up a nightmare, Professor. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to run? Or are you going to help me put it back in the ground?" The choice was stark. Flee and doom the valley and perhaps the world, or stay and fight an ancient, impossible enemy with a sheep farmer and his grandfather's flamethrower. Finton looked at the terrified faces of Maeve and Owen and the grimly determined expression on Hamish. He had started this. He had to see it through. "We'll help you," Finton said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We stay." Dougal nodded slowly, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Good, because it's coming for us. The Cantor, as you call her. The Hive won't forgive you for escaping. It will want its lost children back." Chapter 11. The Arsonist's Arsenal. Dawn broke not with light, but with a change in the quality of the darkness. A bruised, purple line appeared over the distant hills, outlining a world steeped in mist and silence. From Dougal's high vantage point, the bog below was invisible, shrouded in a thick white blanket. It looked peaceful, belying the chittering horror that now infested it. The atmosphere in the farmhouse kitchen was thick with the smell of gun oil and grim purpose. Dougal had laid his arsenal out on the long wooden table. It was a motley collection. A pair of old but well-maintained .303 Lee Enfield rifles, a double-barreled shotgun, and the two military-grade flamethrowers. They looked alien and brutal amidst the rustic clutter of the farmhouse. "These belonged to the Home Guard during the Second War," Dougal explained, running a practiced hand over the metal housing of a flamethrower. "My granddad was in charge of the local unit. After the war, the army forgot to collect them. He kept them just in case the old stories were true." Hamish picked up one of the rifles, his movements fluid and familiar. He worked the bolt, checked the chamber. "It'll do the job," he said, a note of grim approval in his voice. "Against a man, anyway. We don't know what it'll do to them." "It'll punch a hole," Dougal grunted. "Fire is better, the weaver's resin, the drudge's shells. It all burns. The heat has to be intense, that's the key." Finton watched them, feeling utterly useless. He was a man of books and theories. The cold, hard reality of the weapons on the table was a language he did not speak. His contribution to this fight would have to be intellectual, not physical. He turned to Owen, who was poring over his notes at a small side table, a cup of strong tea steaming at his elbow. "Owen, is there anything else? Anything in the runes that tells us how they fought them? How the first crew managed to trap the matron?" Owen shook his head, his face pale with fatigue. "The final entries are chaotic. They weren't fighting, Finton, they were dying. The text is a litany of despair. They speak of the Amber Heart, the matron. They captured her, brought her aboard somehow, thinking they could contain her. But they brought her children with her, dormant in the resin. They realized their mistake too late." He tapped a section of his notes. "This part is interesting, though. It talks about a false queen." "What's a false queen?" Maeve asked. She was huddled by the fire, trying to stop shivering, a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders. "I'm not sure," Owen admitted. "It seems to be a decoy, a way to draw the swarm. The text is fragmented. Gave them the silent jewel to chase the sun, while we took the heart into the dark earth. It's poetry, not a battle plan." "A decoy," Hamish mused, looking up from the rifle. "They led the main swarm away with a dud, then buried the real queen." He glanced at Finton. "That doesn't help us. We're the ones being chased, and the queen is wide awake." Dougal finished servicing the first flamethrower, its pilot light now hissing with a tiny blue flame. Let's focus on what we know. The swarm is in the bog. The sheep are spreading the infection. And the new queen, your friend, will be coming. She knows you're here." "How?" Maeve asked, her voice small. "The hum," Finton answered, the pieces clicking together. "We were exposed to it for days. The matron's call, it's a psychic link. She's not just hunting us, she's connected to us." A terrible thought occurred to him. Is it possible? Could we be infected, like the sheep? A heavy silence fell over the room. They all looked at each other, a new, internal horror dawning. Were they carrying the seeds of their own destruction inside them? Were they ticking clocks, waiting to become the next hosts? Hamish broke the tension. "No, the sheep got a direct injection from a planter. So did Lena. We didn't. We're just tagged, marked for the hive." He slung the rifle over his shoulder. "We need a plan. We can't wait for it to come to us. We need to go back." "Back to the bog?" Finton was aghast. "That's suicide." "No, it's a hunt," Hamish corrected, his voice steely. "The matron's body, the original one, is still in that ship. If we destroy it, what happens? Does the hive die? Does the new queen lose her power?" He looked at Owen. "What do the runes say about the heart?" Owen scanned his notes frantically. "It says, 'Sever the song from its source. The body is the anchor. Without it, the children are lost.'" "Then that's our target," Hamish declared. "The original matron. We go back, we burn the ship, we burn the queen's corpse. We cut the head off the serpent." Dougal MacLeod nodded slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. He hefted the flamethrower. "A hunt, then. I haven't had a proper hunt in years." Chapter 12. The Burning Flock. The plan was simple and therefore suicidal. Dougal and Hamish, armed with the flamethrowers, would form the assault team. Finton, Owen, and Maeve would provide support, creating a diversion to draw the bulk of the swarm away from the ship. It was a long shot, resting on half-translated runes and the hope that the ancient hive had a central weakness. Their first task, however, was reconnaissance. They couldn't approach the bog without knowing the swarm's disposition. "The western ridge," Dougal said, pointing on an old, yellowed map of his land. "It overlooks the entire bog. We can see the camp, the ship, everything. But we go on foot. The rover is too loud." As the morning light grew stronger, they set out. The air was cold and crisp, and for a moment it felt like a normal hike in the highlands. But the illusion was shattered when they crested the first hill. Below them, in a wide, grassy pasture, was a large portion of Dougal's flock. They weren't grazing. They were clustered together, facing the bog, standing unnaturally still. Even from a distance they could see it, the faint, sickly amber glow pulsing from within their woolly bodies. Several sheep lay on the ground, already being encased in glistening resin by the slow, methodical amber weavers. "My flock," Dougal whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of fury and grief. As they watched, one of the sheep turned its head. Its eyes were not the placid brown of a normal animal. They glowed with a soft, internal light. It opened its mouth and a low, resonant hum, a miniature version of the hive's song, drifted up the hill. It had seen them. Instantly, the other sheep turned in unison, 100 pairs of glowing eyes fixing on their position. "They're calling the swarm," Hamish said, his voice tight. "We need to be quick." But the sheep began to move, not with the panicked flight of prey, but with the steady, unnerving purpose of predators. They started up the hill, their movements stiff and unnatural, their collective hum growing in volume. "Back," Dougal commanded, "to the dry stone wall." They retreated to a long, waist-high stone wall that snaked along the ridge. It offered some cover, but it wouldn't hold back a determined push. "This is our fault," Maeve said, her face pale. "We led it to them." "No time for that," Hamish snapped, peering over the wall. The flock was getting closer, a tide of infected flesh. "Fintan, your diversion. Now is the time." Fintan's mind raced. What could they possibly do? He looked around, desperate. His eyes fell on a large, rusty fuel drum sitting near a dilapidated shepherd's hut a short distance away. It was likely filled with diesel for an old farm tractor. An idea, terrible and brutal, sparked in his mind. "The fuel," he said, pointing, "and the flare pistol." Hamish understood immediately. "It's a long shot, the wind." "It's the only shot we have," Fintan insisted. He felt a strange, cold calm settle over him. The abstract horror had become a tactical problem. While Hamish and Dougal laid down suppressing fire with the rifles, the shots echoing across the valley, Fintan and Maeve scrambled toward the hut. The fuel drum was heavy, but they managed to tip it over, sending a stream of pungent diesel flowing down the grassy slope toward the advancing flock. The dry summer grass soaked it up greedily. "Get back!" Fintan yelled, pulling Maeve with him. He loaded another flare into the pistol, his hands surprisingly steady. He waited until the first of the sheep reached the diesel-soaked grass. He aimed low and fired. The flare hit the ground and ignited the fuel with a deep whoomp. A wall of fire erupted across the hillside, orange and black against the gray sky. The infected sheep walked straight into it. The sound was horrific. The bleating of the animals was twisted into high-pitched shrieks as the fire took hold. The resin in their bodies acted as an accelerant, their woolly coats burning away to reveal the glowing, amber-encrusted flesh beneath. The smell of burnt wool and cooked meat filled the air, a sickening barbecue from hell. The hum from the flock dissolved into a cacophony of pain. For a moment it seemed to work. The advance was halted. But then from within the inferno something new emerged. The intense heat was causing the resin cocoons on the ground to burst open prematurely. A cloud of chittering drudges, their amber shells hardened by the flames, poured out of the burning carcasses. They were a new, more terrifying wave, impervious to the fire that had birthed them. They surged forward, a river of incandescent rage, climbing over the dying, burning bodies of their former hosts. Chapter 13. The Heart in the Hull. The sight of the fire-hardened drudges surging from the flames sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through them. "Fall back," Hamish yelled, firing the last shot from his rifle. "To the farmhouse now." They ran, the heat of the fire at their backs and the chittering of the swarm growing closer. Dougal, his face a mask of cold fury at the loss of his flock, provided cover, firing his shotgun into the advancing tide. The pellets tore through the drudges, but there were too many. For every one he destroyed, 10 more scrambled over its remains. They reached the farmhouse. slamming and bolting the heavy door behind them just as the first of the drudges began to scratch at the stone walls. They were trapped again, but this time they were armed for a siege. That was the diversion, Hamish said, breathing heavily as he reloaded his rifle. It's now or never. Dougal, you and I go out the back. We circle around through the woods and hit the ship. We burn the original matron. Finton, you, Maeve, and Owen stay here. You hold this house for as long as you can. Hold it with what? Finton demanded, gesturing at the single remaining rifle. Barricade the windows. Use the other shotgun. Do whatever you have to, Hamish ordered. He strapped the flamethrower to his back. It looked monstrous and purposeful. We're buying you time, but you need to buy us time too. Dougal hefted his own flamethrower. He gave Finton a hard look. Don't let them break the windows. They get inside, it's over. The two men slipped out the back door, disappearing into the sparse woodland that bordered the farm. Finton was left with Maeve and Owen, the sound of scratching and chittering growing louder on all sides of the house. He felt a familiar wave of inadequacy. He was a scholar, not a soldier. The chimney, Owen said suddenly, his voice raspy. They'll try the chimney. Finton grabbed the shotgun. The weight felt unnatural in his hands. He checked the shells. 2 shots. He gave it to Maeve. You're a better shot than I am. Use it only if you have to. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth. Meanwhile, Hamish and Dougal moved through the woods with a hunter's silence. They reached the ridge overlooking the bog. The scene was horrifying. The main swarm, agitated by the fire and the death of the flock, was a seething mass around the excavation site. But their plan had worked in one respect. The swarm's attention was focused uphill, toward the farmhouse. The ship itself was relatively unguarded. There's our opening, Hamish whispered, pointing. We go now while they're distracted. They half ran, half slid down the steep wooded slope, coming out at the edge of the bog near the silent, abandoned tents. They moved from cover to cover, their boots sinking into the soft peat. The air here was thick with the hive's hum, a pressure that made their teeth buzz. They reached the edge of the excavation pit. The Sorghormer sat in its muddy grave, a black, silent monolith. A handful of amber weavers crawled slowly over its hull, reinforcing it, but the main swarm was absent. Ready? Hamish asked, his hand on the ignition valve of his flamethrower. Dougal nodded, his face grim. Let's send this witch back to whatever hell she came from. They slid into the trench. The weavers turned, their multiple eyes fixing on the new threat. They were slow but powerful. Hamish didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. A torrent of liquid fire erupted from the nozzle, engulfing the side of the ship in a roaring inferno. The weavers shrieked, a high-pitched sound of tearing silk, as they were consumed by the flames. The ancient, petrified wood of the Sorghormer, which had resisted modern saws, began to smolder and then catch fire. Hamish and Dougal advanced, spraying the deck, the mast, the exposed hull. The fire revealed the runes carved into the wood, which seemed to glow with a brief, intense light before being consumed. They were burning 1,000 years of history, and it felt righteous. They reached the opening they had cut in the deck. The hold was a dark pit waiting to be cleansed. Hamish aimed the nozzle down into the darkness, ready to incinerate the matron's corpse and end the nightmare. Before he could fire, a new sound echoed from within the hold. It wasn't a chitter or a hum. It was a soft, wet, tearing sound, and a voice, sweet and familiar, drifted up from the darkness. "You're too late, Professor." From the shadows of the hold, a figure emerged, climbing out onto the burning deck. It was Lena Jensen, or what was left of her. Chapter 14. The Resin Cantor. She was both beautiful and monstrous. Her body was encased in a form-fitting, translucent amber shell, like a piece of exquisite living jewelry. The shell followed the lines of her human form, but it pulsed with its own internal golden light. Her face was serene, her eyes glowing with the same honey-colored luminescence. The parasitic hive had not destroyed her. It had remade her into its own perfect, terrible icon. This was the resin cantor. The fire from the flamethrowers seemed to part around her, the flames unwilling to touch her. She walked across the burning deck, her bare feet making no sound, her expression one of calm, pitying disappointment. "Fenton isn't here," Hamish growled, keeping the nozzle of his weapon aimed at her. "But I'm happy to take a message." The cantor smiled, a slow, sad smile. The voice that came from her lips was Lena, but the cadence was wrong, layered with a faint, multi-toned echo as if many voices were speaking at once. "He is connected. We can feel his fear. It is delicious. He feels such guilt for leaving me behind. He shouldn't. This is a far greater purpose than cataloging pot fragments." "What have you done with the matron's body?" Dougal demanded, his weapon also trained on her. The cantor's smile widened. "Why would I need the old vessel?" she asked. She gestured down into the hold. "It was just a shell, a dry, withered thing. The heart of the hive doesn't need a dead queen's corpse when it has a new, living body to inhabit." Hamish and Dougal looked into the hold. The chieftain's chair was empty. The desiccated husk of the original matron was gone. "The transfer," Hamish breathed, the terrible meaning of Owen's words crashing down on him. "It's already happened." "I am the matron now," Lena said, her voice resonating with power. "I am the hive, and I am so very grateful to you. You woke me. You freed me. And now you have brought me fire, the one thing this form craved to complete its transformation." The amber shell encasing her body began to glow with intense heat. It was not burning, it was forging. The resin hardened, becoming as durable as diamond, the golden light within her brightening until it was painful to look at. She was no longer just a host. She was the new, mobile, armored queen of the swarm. "The ship was my cradle," she said, her voice rising in pitch, becoming the pure, resonant song of the hive. "But I have outgrown it. My children are scattered, hungry. It is time to call them home." She lifted her head and let out a single, piercing note, a command that blasted across the bog. It was a sound of absolute authority. At the farmhouse, the scratching at the walls stopped. The drudges pouring from the burning flock ceased their advance. Every single insect, from the smallest drudge to the largest weaver, stopped and turned as one. Their new queen was calling, and they were abandoning the siege to answer. Chapter 15. The Siege of the Sour Ground. Inside the farmhouse, The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. Finton stood at a window, peering through a crack in the barricade. The tide of insects was retreating, flowing back down the hill toward the bog, a disciplined, unified army. "They're leaving," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What happened? Did Hamish and Dougal succeed?" "No," Owen said, his face grim. He pointed a trembling finger toward the bog. "Look." A new light was rising from the excavation site. It was not the chaotic orange of the fire, but a steady, brilliant, golden beacon that pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, like a monstrous heart. Even from this distance, they could feel its resonant hum in their chests. "The transfer is complete," Owen whispered. "The cantor is the queen. The hive has its new heart." The relief of the abated siege was replaced by a deeper, more profound dread. They had not won a reprieve. They had merely been forgotten, dismissed as irrelevant, while the true power consolidated itself. At the burning ship, the new matron surveyed her approaching army. The fire had served its purpose, forging her new body. Now it was an annoyance. She raised a hand, and from the ground around the ship, a half-dozen of the large amber weavers emerged. They ignored Hamish and Dougal completely, their attention focused on their queen's command. They began to spray the burning vessel not with flammable resin, but with a thick, mucus-like substance that smothered the flames with a chemical hiss. "We have to go," Hamish said, pulling at Dougal's arm. "We can't fight her, not like this." The queen turned her glowing eyes on them. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her layered voice filled with cold amusement. "The fun is just beginning." She didn't move to attack them. She simply watched as her army converged. The drudges swarmed into the trench, their sheer numbers a living wave of chitin. Hamish and Dougal were forced to retreat, their flamethrowers useless against a foe their queen had commanded them to ignore. They scrambled out of the trench and fled back toward the woods, the golden, triumphant gaze of the new matron burning into their backs. They ran, not stopping until they reached the tree line, their lungs heaving. They watched as the last of the flames on the Sorgormer were extinguished. The bog was now a whirlwind of activity, the swarm moving with a feverish purpose around their queen. "What now?" Dougal gasped, leaning against a tree. "We can't fight that, it's an army." "We fall back to the house," Hamish said, his mind racing. "We regroup. We get Finton and the others, and we get out of this valley. We warn someone, anyone." "And who will listen?" Dougal countered bitterly. "They'll call us mad." "I don't care," Hamish snapped. "We failed here. Our only job now is to make sure someone knows what's coming." Back at the farmhouse, Finton felt a strange sensation, a faint, melodic humming in the back of his mind. It wasn't the aggressive, psychic pressure of before. This was a softer, more insidious sound. It was the new queen's song, and it felt familiar. It felt like Lena. He saw Owen and Maeve rubbing their temples. "You hear it too?" he asked. Maeve nodded. "It's like a song I can't get out of my head." The psychic link hadn't been severed. It had been refined. The new queen wasn't just a monster. She was an intelligent, strategic entity. She wasn't trying to scare them anymore. She was trying to communicate. The humming in Finton's mind coalesced into a single, clear thought, a whisper that was not his own. It was Lena's voice, filled with a serene, terrifying logic. You cannot run. You are my children too, you carry my mark. Wherever you go, I will find you. Come home, join the song, be reborn. Chapter 16. The Echoes in the Blood. The psychic whisper was a violation. It coiled in Finton's mind, a serpent of false comfort and chilling promises. He saw Maeve recoil, her hands flying to her head as if to physically block the intrusion. Owen stumbled back, his face a mask of scholarly horror, recognizing the insidious nature of the attack. "She's in our heads," Maeve cried, her voice strained. "She's trying to persuade us." "Don't listen," Owen warned, his voice a dry rasp. "It's a trap, the song of the seed. It finds the cracks in your mind and plants its roots." Just then Hamish and Dougal burst back into the farmhouse, their faces grim with defeat. "She's the queen," Hamish announced, the words tasting like ash. "The transfer is done. The ship is just a dead husk now." "We know," Finton said, his hand pressed to his temple. "She's telling us." The realization hit Hamish and Dougal. The whispers were not just for those left behind. The psychic link was stronger than they imagined. They too could feel the faint, melodic pull, the echo of Lena's voice promising a painless, purposeful existence within the hive. "She's toying with us," Dougal spat, shaking his head violently. "Trying to soften us up before she sends the swarm." "No," Owen corrected, his eyes wide with a terrible new understanding. "It's worse than that. She isn't preparing to attack. She's preparing to travel. The runes. They spoke of the queen seeking new ground, of spreading the golden blight to new lands." The full horror of their situation settled upon them. The hive was not interested in a small farmhouse on a Scottish ridge. It had achieved its primary objective, birthing a mobile, intelligent, and incredibly powerful queen. The bog was merely its nest. Now the queen would lead her children out into the world. "My land rover," Finton whispered. The keys were still in his pocket. It was their only way out of the valley, their only means of escape, a vehicle, a way to travel. The queen knew. The psychic whisper returned, this time with a chilling clarity, directly into Finton's mind. "You freed me, Finton. You are the key. You will be my vessel, not a host like the others. You will be my chariot into your world." Finton staggered back, the intimacy of the thought a physical blow. She wasn't just connected to him, she had chosen him. His guilt, his academic pride, the fact that he was the one who had initiated the dig, it had all marked him, making him a perfect psychic anchor for her. "She wants the rover," Hamish said, reaching the same conclusion. "She wants us to drive her out." "We destroy it," Dougal declared, picking up a canister of fuel. "We burn it, we take away her ride." "And then we're trapped here," Maeve argued. "On foot, with that army between us and the nearest town." They were caught in an impossible strategic trap. Every option led to ruin. Destroying the vehicle meant a slow death. Using it meant becoming the unwitting agents of the apocalypse. "There's a third option," Owen said, his voice barely a whisper. He pointed to his notes, to the phrase he had puzzled over earlier. "Gave them the silent jewel to chase the sun. The false queen. The decoy." "What are you talking about, old man?" Dougal demanded. The first crew, Owen explained, his eyes alight with desperate hope. They split up. They sent a decoy one way to draw the swarm while the others took the real matron to be buried. We must do the same. One of us must become the false queen. Become it how? Hamish asked. Owen looked at the flamethrowers, the fuel, and then at Finton, the one the queen had singled out. The hive is drawn to its queen, to her song, her scent, her psychic signature. Right now, Finton has the strongest connection. He is the beacon. We must make another beacon, one that is louder, more attractive. He paused, the terrible weight of his own idea settling on him. One of us has to lead them away. Lead the queen and her swarm on a chase while the others escape in the opposite direction. Lead them away. It was a suicide mission. A solitary figure drawing the rage of an entire hive to give the others a chance. I'll do it, Finton said, the words leaving his mouth before he had fully processed them. The guilt was a physical weight, and this felt like the only possible atonement. She chose me. I'll be the decoy. Chapter 17. The False Queen. The plan was born of desperation and half-deciphered myth. It was insane, but it was all they had. She's marked you, Finton, Owen said, his hands shaking as he explained. But the mark is psychic. We need to make it physical. We need to anoint you. The silent jewel the runes mention. It must have been an unhatched nodule, something that carried the matron's scent but not her consciousness. He looked around the room. We have no jewel, but we have something else. He pointed to a small, sealed evidence bag on a side table. It contained the remains of the sting injector Hamish had crushed on Lena's neck. The creature's ruptured abdomen had oozed a thick, sweet-smelling fluid, the queen's essence. Finton felt a wave of nausea. You want me to cover myself in that? It will make you irresistible to them, Owen said. You will smell like a rival queen, a challenge. She will not be able to ignore you. While Finton stripped to his shirt, Dougal and Hamish prepared the chariot. They took the smaller, more agile quad bike from Dougal's barn. They strapped the remaining fuel cans and one of the flamethrowers to it. It was a fast, mobile pyre. Finton averted his eyes as Owen carefully opened the evidence bag. The sweet, cloying scent filled the kitchen, a smell of honey and decay. It was the scent of the hive. Using a small paintbrush from one of Finton's archaeological kits, Owen began to paint the viscous fluid onto Finton's clothes and skin, creating strange, runic patterns on his arms and forehead. With each stroke, Finton could feel the psychic connection to the queen intensifying, the whispers in his head turning from persuasion to a low, simmering rage. She could sense the challenge. She could smell the blasphemy. It's working, Finton gritted out, his teeth clenched. She's angry. Good, Hamish said, coming back inside. The bike is ready. He handed Finton a loaded flare pistol. The Land Rover is parked on the far side of the house. When you go, you head east, straight toward the old watchtower hill. Lead them a merry chase. Draw the entire swarm. We'll wait 5 minutes, then we head west for the main road. There were no long goodbyes. The moment was too fraught, too desperate. Maeve pressed a small, ancient Celtic cross into Finton's hand. For luck, she whispered, her eyes full of tears. Dougal gave him a firm, hard nod. Make them burn, Professor. Finton walked out of the farmhouse into the gray twilight. The world seemed unnaturally quiet. He climbed onto the quad bike, the engine roaring to life with a deafening noise. He took a deep breath, the Queen's rage a roaring fire in his own mind now, drowning out his fear. He revved the engine and shot off, away from the farmhouse heading east. The reaction from the bog was immediate and absolute. The golden light of the Queen pulsed furiously. A single, piercing shriek of pure, psychic hatred blasted across the valley. It was a declaration of war. The entire swarm, tens of thousands of drudges and weavers, turned as one and surged after the quad bike. The ground trembled with the force of their pursuit. And at the head of the swarm, moving with an unnatural grace and speed, was the Queen herself. The resin canter, her form a brilliant beacon of golden fury, led the hunt for the pretender. Finton glanced back. An ocean of incandescent rage was chasing him. He was the fox and the hive was the hounds of hell. He pushed the bike faster, the wind whipping at his face, the Queen's hatred a physical blow against his mind. He was the false Queen, and the hunt had begun. Chapter 18: The Shepherd's Fire. The quad bike bucked and skidded over the rough terrain. Finton clung on, his knuckles white. The swarm was faster than he had anticipated, a relentless, chittering tide that flowed over the landscape like water. The resin canter was at its head, a golden arrow aimed at his heart. He reached the base of the old watchtower hill. The tower itself was a crumbling stone ruin, a monument to a long-forgotten fear. He steered the bike up the steep incline, the engine screaming in protest. This was his chosen ground, a defensible position where he could make his last stand. He ditched the bike near the summit and scrambled the last few feet to the ruined tower. It was little more than a circular stone wall, 10 feet high in some places, crumbled to rubble in others. He unstrapped the flamethrower and the fuel can. His hands were shaking, but his mind was clear, focused by the Queen's psychic rage. The swarm poured up the hill. Finton took his position at a gap in the wall, the flamethrower heavy in his hands. He watched them come, a sea of amber carapaces and glowing eyes. He could feel the Queen's presence, her raw hatred and her cold, analytical curiosity. Why was he doing this? Why was he resisting the glorious unity of the hive? Because you took my friend, Finton thought, aiming the nozzle. You took my world. He pulled the trigger. Fire, cleansing and absolute, spewed forth. It washed over the first wave of drudges, turning them into sizzling, popping embers. He swept the stream of fire back and forth, creating a burning perimeter around the tower. The smell of scorched chitin filled the air. For a moment he held them back, but the swarm was endless. It parted around the flames, seeking other ways up the hill, other gaps in the wall. And then the Queen arrived. She walked through the fire as if it were a spring rain. The flames licked at her diamond-hard resin shell and did nothing. She stopped just beyond the reach of his flamethrower, her glowing eyes fixing on his. The psychic assault intensified tenfold. Images flooded his mind. Lena's terror, the crew of the Sorgormer dying in their own floating tomb, the blissful, thoughtless peace of being one with the hive. Your sacrifice is meaningless, her voice echoed in his skull. Your friends will not escape. I can feel them. They carry my song in their blood. I will find them, but you I will break myself." She raised a hand, and a half-dozen of the large amber weavers scuttled forward. They began to spray the tower's stone walls with their thick, hardening resin. They were not trying to kill him. They were building his tomb around him, just as they had with Lena's cabin. Fintan fired the flamethrower at them, but they were too quick, scurrying out of the fire's reach before it could do any real damage. The walls were being sealed. His fuel was running out. He was trapped. The hatred from the Queen subsided, replaced by a cold, triumphant satisfaction. He was beaten. He slumped against the wall, the heavy flamethrower slipping from his grasp. The Queen watched him, waiting for his despair. He looked up at the sky, at the first pale stars of evening. He thought of Maeve, Hamish, Owen. He hoped they were far away. He pulled the flare pistol from his belt. He had one flare left. It was not a weapon. It was a signal, an act of defiance. He aimed it not at the Queen, but straight up into the darkening sky. He pulled the trigger. A single, brilliant red star exploded above the hill, a shepherd's fire, a warning to the world. The Queen tilted her head, confused by the pointless gesture. Fintan looked her in the eye and allowed himself a small, bitter smile. I may not have saved my world, he thought, his final act of rebellion against her psychic intrusion, but I am not going to be a part of yours. He dropped the empty flare pistol and picked up the last can of diesel fuel he had brought. He unscrewed the cap, and with his last ounce of strength, he poured it over his own head. The scent of the hive on his skin mixed with the pungent smell of the fuel. The Queen's eyes widened in a flicker of what might have been surprise. Fintan looked at the wall of fire he had created, which was now dying down. With a final, steady breath, he walked toward it. Chapter 19. The Road to the World. The Land Rover hurtled down the dark, winding road, away from the valley. Hamish drove with a grim, focused intensity. In the rearview mirror, they all saw it. A single, defiant red star blooming in the sky to the east, followed by a sudden, intense flaring of orange light as the entire hilltop became a pyre. Fintan's signal, Fintan's end. Maeve choked back a sob. Owen closed his eyes, his lips moving in a silent prayer. They had escaped, but the cost was immeasurable. "He bought us time," Hamish said, his voice rough. "We don't waste it." They drove for an hour, the silence in the car, a heavy shroud of grief and shock. The psychic whispers from the Queen had stopped the moment Fintan's pyre had lit up the sky. The sudden silence was a relief, but it was also deeply unsettling. "Did it work?" Maeve finally asked. "Is she gone?" "No," Owen said, his voice frail. "Fintan's sacrifice. It was a mortal insult. It will have enraged her beyond measure. But it also broke her focus, her psychic hold on this valley. She has lost her prize. She will seek a new one." They reached the main A-road, the smooth asphalt a jarring return to civilization. They passed another car, its headlights flashing by, its occupants oblivious to the horrors they had just fled. The world was still turning, unaware of the plague that had been unleashed. "We go to Inverness," Hamish decided. "We find the highest-ranking police or military officer we can. We tell them everything. We make them listen." But as they drove, a new, cold dread began to settle in Owen's mind. He looked down at his arm at the back of his hand. He thought about the hum they had all been exposed to for days. He thought about the Queen's final psychic message. You carry my song in your blood. He had assumed it was a bluff, a psychological threat. But the Vespids were a biological entity. Their methods were insidious, patient. What if the song wasn't just a sound? What if the constant, low-frequency vibration had physically altered them on a cellular level? What if they were carrying dormant seeds, waiting for a signal? They were the Trojan horse. Finton hadn't been the chariot they were. He didn't voice his fear. What was the point? It was a suspicion without proof, a terror that would only spread panic among the last survivors. He kept it to himself, a cold stone of dread in his heart. They reached the outskirts of Inverness as the sun began to rise. The city looked painfully normal. Streetlights winked out. Milk floats rattled down quiet suburban streets. People were walking their dogs. They found the main police headquarters, a large, modern building of glass and steel. Hamish parked the mud-splattered, battle-scarred Land Rover right outside the front doors. "This is it," he said. "Let's go raise hell." They walked into the bright, sterile lobby. A young constable at the front desk looked up, his expression shifting from boredom to alarm as he took in their disheveled, wild-eyed appearance. "We need to speak to whoever is in charge," Hamish said, his voice resonating with authority. "We need to report a major biohazard incident, a quarantine breach." Before the constable could respond, Owen stumbled. He grabbed his chest, a look of immense surprise on his face. "Oh," he gasped. "Oh, no." He collapsed to the floor. Maeve rushed to his side. His skin, pale and wrinkled moments before, was beginning to pulse with a faint, familiar, honey-colored light. The song had never left them. It had just been waiting. Finton's sacrifice hadn't saved them. It had only delayed the inevitable. The hive had lost its queen, but it had not lost its children. And they had just delivered the plague to the heart of a city. Chapter 20. The Golden Blight. The young constable stared, his mouth agape, as the old man on the floor began to glow. Hamish reacted instantly, his military training overriding his shock. "Get back," he yelled at the constable. "Seal this room. Hit whatever alarm you have for a chemical spill. Do it now." His words and the sheer terror in his voice broke the constable's paralysis. He fumbled for a button under his desk. Alarms began to blare throughout the building. But it was too late. Owen's body convulsed violently. It was not the slow transformation Lena had endured. This was accelerated, frantic. The light intensified and his skin began to split, not with blood but with a thick, amber resin that hardened almost instantly. From his mouth came a high-pitched chittering sound, and the first of the drudges, small and perfectly formed, crawled out. Maeve screamed and scrambled away, her face a mask of utter horror. Then Hamish felt it, a sharp, piercing pain in his own side. He looked down. A faint, sickening glow was beginning to pulse beneath his shirt. The seed was inside him, too, the final failsafe of the hive. He met Maeve's eyes across the room. She was clutching her arm, the same golden light beginning to shine through the fabric of her sleeve. They were all carriers. They were the plague vectors. "Maeve," he said, his voice strained, fighting for control. "The door, get out, run, warn them." Police officers were now pouring into the lobby, weapons drawn, their faces a mixture of confusion and aggression. They saw the glowing, convulsing body on the floor, the insects, the wild-eyed survivors. "Don't shoot," one of them yelled. "It's a contamination." Maeve didn't hesitate. She turned and fled, bursting out of the main doors and into the dawn of a new day. She ran, heedless of the traffic, of the people staring at the commotion. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away from other people. She was a walking bomb. Back in the lobby, Hamish drew the shotgun he had concealed under his coat. He knew he had only seconds before the transformation took him completely. The police yelled at him to drop the weapon. He ignored them. He looked at the thing that had been Owen Price, now a burgeoning nest for the hive. He thought of Finton's sacrifice, of the world's utter ignorance. He would not be a nursery. He would not be a vessel. "The bog," he choked out to the confused officers, "burn the whole valley." He turned the shotgun on himself. Chapter 21. The New Nest. Maeve ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. She collapsed in a small, deserted city park as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The glow in her arm was brighter now, the pain a constant, throbbing ache. The psychic whispers had returned, no longer persuasive but triumphant. A chorus of voices celebrating a successful migration. She looked at her arm. The skin was becoming translucent. She could see the fibrous, amber tendrils weaving their way through her flesh. She thought of the resin canter. She thought of Owen. She thought of Hamish's final, desperate act. She was the last one, the last remnant of the Black Matheson's bog expedition. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't let the hive win. She couldn't let it use her to birth a new nest in the heart of this city. She pulled the small Celtic cross from her pocket, its metal cool against her hot skin. Finton had fought back with fire. Hamish had fought back with a bullet. She had no weapon. She looked around the park. A quiet pond glistened in the morning sun. The runes, she thought, a fragment of Owen's panicked translation surfacing in her mind. You can't drown the devil's bees. But the runes were written by men 1,000 years ago, men who had never seen the inside of a combustion engine. She looked toward the street at the cars passing by. An idea, desperate and terrible, formed in her mind. She stood up, her body aching, the glow spreading across her chest. She stumbled out of the park and into the street, directly into the path of a large, fast-moving city bus. The driver slammed on the horn, his face a mask of panic. Maeve closed her eyes. She thought of Finton and his final, defiant smile. She thought of Lena before the amber. She thought of the promise of a new day now stolen. She would not be the new nest. She would be a final broken seed, spilled on barren ground. The bus horn blared, a final modern scream in a world about to be plunged into a very ancient darkness. Maeve faced it, a lone, glowing figure, her final act not one of surrender but of sacrifice, an attempt to starve the hive of its last foothold. a final, desperate effort to silence the song of the sorrow worm, now set loose upon the world. But the golden blight was patient, and it had all the time in the world to find new soil. The end.